Well, thank you for staying for this session. This is the time slot for, this is the coma time slot. This is when you sat down for 2.5, 3 hours and your lunch is starting to kick in. But we're going to keep this incredibly lively. It was supposed to be a 35-minute session. We're going to keep it to 30 minutes. We're going to have very quick answers, and we're going to solve the biggest problem to be discussed here at the entire conference, and that is, how do we make policy making better? How do we make it work? I work at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington. Like 4 of the 5 people on this panel, I'm trained as a scientist. We have a geophysicist, a geneticist, a chemist, and a technologist. You're the only lawyer with a background in international affairs, so she belongs up here. But what we're going to do is examine how countries make digital policy and policies that affect the deployment of everything from artificial intelligence to big data, wireless technologies. And we're just going to ask the question, how can it be done better, and who's doing it wisely? I have a hidden agenda here, which is to be the most tweeted about panel of the conference. So I invite all of you on Twitter to put you on your phone for a minute, go over to Twitter, and start tweeting about all the wise things that the panelists will be saying. And if we do that right, we'll be the most viral of all the videos from this conference. So my first question to all the panelists is, you've been working with countries around the world, helping them develop policies for digital technologies. Which countries do you admire? Which ones are doing this right? And why is it working? And I'll give you a 40-second example. I've been lucky enough to work in the Clinton White House at the very early days of the commercial internet, and I would argue that we did it right. We had some advantages. It was a billion-dollar industry, not a trillion-dollar industry, so there weren't many food fights. And we had Vice President Gore, who brought all the agencies together to hammer out consensus. But the other thing that we did is we had a clear vision. And I think that's the most important thing, at least in those early days. So that was the example. I'll now turn to you and ask you, who would you look to as a guide, somebody who's doing it right? I'm not going to ask the other question. If we had 5 more minutes, I would ask the other question, which is, which country is doing it really badly, and who should we never emulate? But we're starting out positive.
Thank you, Michael. That's a trick question, and I'm not going to fall for it. So rather than name the countries who are doing it right, I'm going to question the premise of the question, like who defines what is right?
You do.
Okay, based on that definition, I would praise some countries who are following the right approach to policy making, which is being receptive to live feedback from the communities that they are trying to serve. Because in digital, the distance between policy enactment and seeing its effects on the ground and seeing its follow-on effects on other things take place over long timelines. And if we look at all the digital technologies currently in play, DPI, AI, all of these things, they are still evolving. So I don't think there is a right, but that right is customized to local context. So for example, I could say in India, there are great examples of policy making when it comes to how to do digital ID right, how to follow principles of data minimization. If we look at payments, the idea of interoperability is right. And not only India, but other countries such as Brazil, I would say has done a fantastic job on payments. There are some countries like Estonia who have done a great job on data sharing, Singapore. So many examples everywhere, but I think it's the local context that matters when we try to define what is right.
Thank you. That was exactly what we needed. Nivedita?
I think from my perspective, having worked mostly in the US-India space, I would say that we've actually turned how we're thinking about managing regulation between our 2 countries. And I take that as a great example. You all heard Dr. Jaishankar, and he framed it very well last evening. He said, responsibility and competition don't always go together. And I think at the heart of the issue that we're discussing is really how do we bring effective regulation where we're thinking about the community. So I think there's an opportunity for us to pursue that line of dialogue. And in the US-India community and in policy making, what we're now trying to do is look at technology from the lens of what can we develop together? How do we best use Indian talent and US innovation to come together? And I think that's where we see the future to be.
Do you have a particular example of a country that's in one particular area that's doing something that the rest of the world should know about? Sometimes it's a small country. I mean, we all admired what Estonia did more than 15 years ago. Do you have any other examples like Estonia that you would?
No, nothing coming to my mind right now.
Okay.
But I'll come back to that.
Hi. I think for me it's a no-brainer. I would say from what we are talking about in terms of placing technology in a development paradigm, in a democratic setup, I think it's India, which has got many things right. If you look at the JAM Trinity, which is the Jan Dhan Yojana, the financial inclusion program, and the identification and the use of mobile technology together to deliver a particular, welfare program and benefits directly to the people. I think in that way we have done pretty well. Looking at the size and the complexity that is involved, I mean, from that I think the prize should go to India. It's a no-brainer for me.
When I try to sell policies, I always look for the special factoid, the number that really convince people that everything is. I'm a physicist, so I like numbers.
When it comes to numbers, we beat everybody hands down, probably.
You have lots of big numbers, yes.
Yeah.
But one of
Good
the most
numbers.
impressive is that Aadhaar has enabled you to dramatically cut the misallocation of benefit payments. And it's not like, they decreased the fraud by 10%. It was, in some cases, 50%. An extraordinary success rate. But let me dig a little deeper. Why did India accomplish this? What were the 2 or 3 things that aligned? Because I've been working with India for 30 years. I came here in 1985, actually, and I've been back several times. 20 years ago, I would talk to agencies, and I would learn not only were they not cooperating with other agencies, which is normal in every government I've ever seen, they weren't cooperating with themselves. And you would read a document, and it was clearly written by 2 different camps in the agency. And typically the first part would say, "We are in an unprecedented age. The technology will allow incredible things if we don't get in the way." And then the next paragraph would say, "And this technology is so important that we need a 5-year plan and a clear boundaries on what will be done." And then the next would go back to the open, free, innovative rhetoric. Somehow something's changed. What is the success story here? Why is there more coherent policy making?
I think the need for delivery, the focus is on delivery of services to the people. I mean the last mile, and that I think that very urge to deliver at any cost. All the challenges that we had in the system, the complexities and all the absurdities that some of them you described, notwithstanding all of them, they're going to be there. We are a very large, unwieldy system. But the laser focus, sharp, objective is to deliver. So once you had that, then rest of the things I think fell in place.
Yeah.
So that's the only difference I think that made the...
In some ways, COVID helped focused attention on
Yeah,
moving to the new online environment, collaborating, sharing. But, okay. Well, again, I've just seen such an impressive change. So, Carsten?
Yeah, thank you. Well, there's a lot of examples, and we've just heard some there, and there's examples of really bad engagement.
Well, if you want to answer that question too,
No,
I'll give you an extra 90 seconds.
No, it's okay. Because I want to talk about something that's rather than just an example, is culturally, I think Sweden has got a great engagement with its people, and it's really hard to do. So Sweden has got lots of multi-stakeholder platforms that they've developed. So they use tech as well as non-tech. But whether it's water initiatives or water and pharmaceuticals that they've tried to address, or if it's sustainable forest management, where you've got lots of different stakeholders, or a climate framework, Sweden really tries to get that multi-stakeholder engagement. And the OECD recently in a report said stakeholder engagement continues to be ingrained into the lawmaking process in Sweden. And I think that's an example for us all. They bring together, they have these communities, committees of inquiry for policy, which brings together relevant stakeholders, so policymakers, academics and experts, politicians, civil society, really early on in the consultation process. The committee looks at the report that's generated, and then that is sent out for comment before any legislation is drawn up in general. And a specific example was in a few years ago, where the Committee for Technological Innovation and Ethics created a forum for feedback from citizens and businesses on regulatory reforms. And what I liked about what they did is they analysed the feedback, and from that feedback created 11 different feasibility studies. So they took the information, they then assessed it through feasibility studies before deciding on policy. And I think it's difficult because it takes some time. One could argue about, we've talked about the speed of DPI being important and other kinds of policy around national digital agenda. But I think you've got to balance that speed with getting it right in the first place and understanding the many different stakeholders. And I don't see that really embedded in many countries, and I think Sweden does it quite well. They have been criticised occasionally, some reports, for not following that process, but at least there is a vision to create that.
Well, as somebody whose parents are both half Swedish American, I'm glad that you mentioned them, but I'm also quarter Danish American. And I would say that the Danes are even more impressive in how they have done two things right. They've pushed a lot of the consultation down to the local level. So they have a lot of communities that actually gather to talk about what the right thing to do is, and then they gather the good ideas at the local level that feeds into the larger level. And they've been incredibly successful in deploying new communications technology. They were 5-10 years ahead of a lot of other parts of Europe, partly because they took a yes and approach. A lot of other countries would say, okay, well, we have Deutsche Telekom, they'll take care of everything, and they'll deploy ADSL and one answer for everyone. In Denmark, they said, well, the little islands, they need wireless, and oh, we have a cable infrastructure in this town, and they really did a nice job of having competing answers. So that, I think, is a nice way to make sure you listen to the best ideas no matter where they come from. If you have to have one answer, then you tend to get a good answer, but it's not as good as 3 answers.
And I think if people feel that they're listened to, they'll engage further, and that's one of the problems sometimes. You just have to look at some of the elections around the world, or especially local rather than general, and the turnout is not great of those eligible to vote. They don't feel engaged in significant events, and I think if you can get it right and people in Denmark are feeling listened to, then they will engage further because they feel it's worth their effort and time.
One theme we've been hearing for the last day and a half is South-South cooperation, and I know you've spent a lot of time working on that. I sit in Washington, and we have lots of meetings about how do we help the Global South close the gap in terms of digital development. But it's always framed in the terms of, oh, what can the U.S. and the EU do to help Africa, Latin America, Asia? So often, that's not what's really needed. If you're in Burundi, you don't necessarily need to hear an example from Chicago. You need to hear an example from southern India. What have you seen that's really worked? This is sort of the same question. What collaborations have enabled countries to move faster and improve their digital policy making?
I think one of the things, I've just been in Benin last week, okay. And it was a West African conference on cybersecurity. And of course, CDPI, for example, with their Centre for Digital Public Infrastructure, MOSIP were there, who have got a great open source identity platform, and others, and governments. And they gathered together people from largely from West Africa, all about sharing ideas that would work well. They did bring in some experts from overseas, but not really to tell them what to do, but just to give some lessons that we've observed from other places around the world. But what I felt was really strong is people just learning from each other, asking each other questions. So there was, for example, around Nigeria, asking about how Ethiopia were developing their national digital identity program and what were the challenges and what worked well. And that's what I see as really important, creating that local capacity, finding out the challenges. You know, Ethiopia, for example, are very, very keen on having a local capacity, bringing up their talent within the country, getting some cybersecurity expertise, recognizing that there may be better expertise outside globally, of course, but the importance of growing that internally was seen as really important. I think one of the things they'd like to do is find ways to have better interoperability and better data sharing. I think that still remains a little bit of a challenge at the moment, but the vision and the hope is certainly there, and that really heartened me.
Yeah, if we can get past this idea that data is the new oil and that you shouldn't share it, then that'll make it easier. Kanwaljit, I'm going to ask you two questions. You're at the Gates Foundation. You've been doing a lot to foster growth of the digital public infrastructures around the world. That's the other term that we've heard. What do you think that we need to do there, and what do we learn from the Gates Foundation experience?
I think if we look at the role that digital public infrastructure plays in solving the world's problems, the credit that I would give it is that it increases the capacity, capability, and speed of the ability to solve problems without directly solving problems. And I think this is important to make that distinction because our mind tends to operate in a very linear way. See a problem, solve a problem. But if we abstract the problems out to classes, okay, what can we do so that this little intervention here solves problems of this entire class? For example, if we look at digital identity, the ability to prove who you are is a very fundamental need in every sort of government, people interaction, business interaction, business to business interaction. And the fact that we haven't really solved for identity platforms in a consistent way kind of speaks to how fragmented our efforts usually are. The ability to pay anyone, anywhere is a common problem, domestically, globally, cross borders, in any way you cut it. We talk about data sharing a lot. Well, consent is almost treated as an afterthought. Mm-hmm. How do you capture consent? How do you capture consent in an equitable way? How do you capture consent from somebody who does not have a phone? How do you capture consent from somebody who cannot read? How do you make sure the consent capture is actually meaningful? So these are all problems which are common to a lot of use cases. And I think this is where the DPI approach has power, where you solve a problem at a fundamental, minimalistic building block sort of way, which allows you to apply to many, many more use cases and generate cost efficiencies which are really exponential in nature.
So I'm going to be a journalist and get more specific and ask you the same question you didn't answer before. If you look at these efforts to promote digital public infrastructure, is there a particular case study that the Gates Foundation points to and says, boy, that really worked. You know, we made a small investment and we got the right people and they did the right things. Is there one or two countries that we should point to?
Absolutely. In fact, I can actually throw in some numbers. So for example, we talked about digital ID. The foundation made a small investment in creating an open source ID system. We call it MOSIP, the Modular Open Source Identity Platform, following the approach of build it once, give it away, and see how many countries use it. So today, MOSIP is being deployed in 11 countries. 2 weeks ago, MOSIP crossed 100 million registrations in 3 countries, the Philippines, Ethiopia, and Morocco, with 8 others piloting it. And if we look at the amount of investment that went into
That's
making
not 10%. That's like 80% of the
That's
population.
right.
Yeah.
So Philippines, 80% of the adult population in Philippines is registered on the MOSIP platform. So that's a small investment which has just started yielding results, and we aren't even getting started yet. So there are more countries signing up, more use cases that are being built on this open source platform can be now exported from country to country. So for example, Philippines and Ethiopia are both adopters of the open source ID platform, and as part of peer learning, the countries learn from each other. Hey, how did you solve that QR code thing? Well, that's how we solved it. Okay, fine, I'll do it too. And that sort of learning really unlocks network effects which are really profound.
And since everybody's tweeting this, and that was a great factoid, what's the hashtag? I want to make sure they spell MOSIP properly.
Hashtag MOSIP, MOSIP. And if you go to the website mosip.io, you get to see a great video of 2 minutes that talks about how MOSIP got 100 million registrations.
Excellent. Nivedita, you are the most multi-stakeholder person here. We have government, we have academia. I'm a little bit of everything. You're in philanthropy, but you work with all these different sectors. I'm going to ask you the same question that we just asked about the role of philanthropy. Here in India, we don't have as many large, mega billionaires who get tax write-offs for foundations like Andrew Carnegie. What would you think could be done to leverage the philanthropies here in India and elsewhere?
I think what we saw during COVID was actually remarkable because it got the philanthropic thinking going much more in India. And I will speak to that from the multinational corporation perspective. Prior to that, we always saw them thinking about immediate win or benefit of their CSR spend, and it was just a CSR spend. What we've tried to do since then is a much more community approach, where they're actually now taking on key issues and challenges and seeing how they can build on that. So I'll give you an example. During COVID, the government actually built the Coven platform, right, which has been a huge success.
I think it's a little closer. Yeah.
And they were able to, vaccinate, I think, over 2 billion people, right? Using that same infrastructure, we're now talking to the government about how do they use it for adult immunization. How do you tackle key diseases which can keep people out of hospitals, right? So there's a lot of infrastructure which was built at that time, but now the private sector can utilize that to support the government's public health interests. So there are much more thoughtful partnerships which companies are thinking about, and they're also working much closer with the community in the country rather than, I have to deploy one project and I'll do it without partnership with others. So it's a much more thoughtful process.
Over to you, Raj. Building on what she just said, as you look at the landscape here in India, 95% of the money that goes to social programs comes directly from the government. There's a little bit of a role for the private sector and philanthropies. In the States, we find the philanthropies are incredibly useful for trying out risky new things. And they also, in some cases, provide dashboards and transparency into what government's doing. And so they can put pressure on government agencies to fix things that might be wasting money or might not be effective. What else do you see the philanthropies doing, or what potential things could they do here in India, particularly with regard to emerging technologies and new infrastructure?
I would say there are a lot of diffused efforts, because philanthropy in India is also a sort of a cultural thing. It's not viewed from a very policy, corporate-driven, tax incentivized approach. It's also a sort of a way of life, cultural thing. So it percolates into every domain. I can't immediately think of examples in the digital domain, but I'm sure there are out there many. I have interacted a couple of days back here also. So there are Carnegie has got some young ambassadors for GTS ambassadors, and some of them are exactly doing that work developing apps which are targeting, it doesn't look like philanthropy in a traditional sense,
Right.
but it is solving a particular problem of a particular community, which is very sort of very niche, and it often escapes the macro sweep of the policy when viewed from Delhi or from state capitals. So I'm sure it's out there.
Yeah, well, we did not coordinate this. I did not ask him to give a plug for the Carnegie India team, but they are amazing. But are there other groups that are doing some of this work? Are there civil society groups that are kind of bringing new ideas to the discussion, trying to push government agencies in a new, bolder direction?
The conversation.
Are the journalists doing this? I mean,
So the conversations are happening right here, where we have partnered with Carnegie on this. So you will see those ideas coming up in the last 2 days and tomorrow again. So the whole approach is to bring as many stakeholders as possible, and there is no other way but to be participative. There is you want the technology to be quickly adopted, and technology is not for the sake of technology. We are not talking in a what do you say, an innovation ecosystem where tech is being developed. We are talking in an ecosystem where tech is being used as a policy tool for governance, delivery of policy, and in a country like India, social engineering. It's happening at multiple levels. So it's a very organic thing that's happening at multiple levels.
We don't have much time left, but I have a real quick question for you that we did not discuss earlier. But in our preliminary conversation, you mentioned that you have one of the world's hardest jobs because you operate at the intersection of a Venn diagram where one circle is international relations and the other one is planning. And since international relations is so unpredictable, there's such a small overlap, you have to function in a very unpredictable place, and you're focusing on technology, which is changing faster than almost anything. And we have markets that are collapsing. We have companies, $20 billion companies that disappear in a week. Any advice for people who are trying to make sense of this chaotic world that you're trying to plan?
Do more and more events like this. Let ideas come from everywhere, so that we know.
I didn't ask for that either.
So the idea is to the meta idea is to let ideas come from everywhere and partner with as many people as possible. And I say people cross-cutting across
That's how you get the
various
early
domains
warning.
of the society. So that's what we are doing. You can't plan for an uncertain world. So the idea is to build as much resilience and make the systems more strong and be prepared. That's the only thing.
I spent a lot of time talking to oddballs, people who are considered kind of at the fringe, because often they will lead you to answers you've never seen, and they tell you about the things that are coming. So now we're in the Twitter round. This is the tweet round. We have 2 minutes left. Each of you have 30 seconds to give us the 280-character tweet that they want everybody to go home from this session in. They want everybody to tweet it. This is the thing that you want in their brain and coming out of their mouth for weeks to come, maybe months to come. Carsten.
So I'll take inspiration from a former British Prime Minister and say conversation.
You have a lot of them.
We do. But conversation. Effective policy requires proper multi-stakeholder engagement, and that means bringing together policymakers, academics, experts, and businesses too.
Kanwal?
Well, I don't have a Twitter account, but if there was one message that I hope people remember, it is that DPI brings about exponential change. Let's not think in linear incremental change terms.
I like that.
So I just jotted something down. Democratically transcending the ticking tech time bomb.
That's even shorter than a tweet, but much more visual. And the last word goes to Raj.
So I would say 3 C's: collaboration, a willingness to collaborate with everybody, clarity of purpose. Why are we doing this? And a mentality for course correction, because you need to be ready, because we are all experimenting with new and emerging technologies in a policy domain. So you should have the willingness and the agility for course correction as you go along. I think these 3 C's will take us along.
That reminds me of my favorite Bible verse, which is very tweetable. Where there is no vision, the people perish. We need to have a sense of where we're going. We have 4 seconds left. I want to thank you all for a great discussion, holding to the time, and I want to thank all of you for being here. Tweet away.